The deafening applause of proud parents filled the school auditorium, but Janet Wilkins heard none of it. Her breath caught in her throat as she locked eyes with him from across the room. Chad Huntsworth, the billionaire tech CEO, whose brilliant smile had once captivated her heart before he'd stolen her groundbreaking research and destroyed her career. 5 years of carefully rebuilding her life shattered in an instant as their gazes collided, sending electricity through her body that was equal parts attraction and fury. She deliberately turned away, her hands trembling slightly, the gold bangles from her grandmother softly clinking at her wrist. 5 years hadn't been enough to erase the memory of his betrayal. The way he'd smiled at her, just before taking everything she'd worked for. "Mommy, why are you pretending you don't know that man?" Jaden whispered, tugging at her sleeve. Always observant, that one, her analytical son missed nothing. His twin sister Janice leaned in, her wide eyes curious. "He keeps looking at you." Janet drew a steadying breath, her brown fingers instinctively reaching to touch the gold bangles from her grandmother at her wrist. "Because he's the man who stole my life's work and broke my heart," she thought, but couldn't say aloud. She felt his approach before she saw him, the subtle shift in the air, the weight of his gaze on her back. When she turned, Chad stood before her, his green eyes intense against his pale skin, the sharp contrast of his tailored suit highlighting his towering presence. A flash of something vulnerable crossed his usually controlled face, his jaw clenching visibly as he looked at her. "Janet," he said, her name like a prayer on his lips. "I didn't expect to see you here." She squared her shoulders, steeling herself against the current running between them. "I teach here now. The real question is, what are you doing at an elementary school science fair, Mr. Huntsworth?" "Hello once again, my beautiful Royal Story family. I'm curious, where in this beautiful world are you watching from today? Whether you're in a bustling city or a quiet village, drop your location in the comments below. If you enjoy these stories, please subscribe and hit the notification bell to join our Royal Story family. You'll never miss a new upload. The school fundraiser buzzed with energy as Janet moved between displays, her passion for science evident in every animated gesture. She'd found her calling here, teaching children to see wonder in the fundamental truths of the universe. Her dark skin glowed under the gymnasium lights as she knelt beside a young student's volcano, encouraging questions with the same brilliant mind that had once revolutionized pharmaceutical research. "Miss Wilkins? You make everything sound so exciting," exclaimed little Alia, her eyes bright with curiosity. "That's because science is exciting," Janet replied, her smile genuine and warm. "Every experiment is a chance to discover something new about our world." From across the room, Chad watched her with growing admiration. This wasn't the same Newman he'd known 5 years ago at Meridian Laboratories. This Janet commanded respect effortlessly, her intelligence shining through every interaction. He'd forgotten how beautiful she was when she spoke about her work. The way her eyes lit up, how her hands moved expressively, the musical quality of her laughter. Their eyes met briefly across the crowded room, and Janet's smile faltered. The easy warmth she showed her students vanished, replaced by cool professionalism tinged with something deeper, hurt that hadn't fully healed despite the years. Chad's imposing presence seemed to fill the space as he approached the fundraiser tables. At 6'2", with his perfectly styled blonde hair and custom suit, he was impossible to ignore. Several teachers whispered among themselves, clearly recognizing the billionaire CEO whose company dominated the local tech landscape. "Ladies and gentlemen," Principal Matthews announced, his voice carrying over the noise, "I'd like you to meet Chad Huntsworth, CEO of Huntsworth Innovations. His company has generously agreed to sponsor our STEM program." Polite applause filled the room, but Janet felt her stomach drop. 3 years of sponsorship meant 3 years of avoiding the man who had once been her research partner, her intellectual equal, and the person she'd trusted with her heart before he'd shattered both her career and her faith in love. As the principal continued his introduction, memories flooded back unbidden. 5 years ago, she and Chad had been the rising stars of Meridian Laboratories' research division. Their chemistry had been undeniable, both in the lab and out of it. Late nights perfecting her chemical stabilization formula had turned into intimate dinners, shared dreams of revolutionizing pharmaceutical storage in developing countries, and stolen kisses between experiment sessions. Then came the morning she'd watched in stunned silence as Chad presented her groundbreaking work to the board as his own discovery. Her formula, the breakthrough that could preserve life-saving medications in extreme temperatures, had become his pathway to corporate success. By the time she'd gathered her wits to protest, the damage was done, her word against his, the brilliant newcomer versus the established executive's son. Now here he was, standing in her sanctuary, watching her with those piercing green eyes that once made her feel like the most fascinating woman in the world. "Mommy, look," Janice called out, waving frantically from their science display. "People want to see our project." Janet welcomed the distraction, making her way through the crowd toward her twins. At 8 years old, Jaden and Janice were as different as night and day, yet they balanced each other perfectly. Jaden approached the world with methodical curiosity, asking probing questions that often stumped adults. Janice saw beauty in everything, her creative mind finding elegant solutions through intuition and artistry. Their current project, an innovative water filtration system, drew an impressed crowd. Jaden stood proudly beside their technical diagrams, explaining the science with the precision of a graduate student. "We used activated carbon and ceramic filters," he explained proudly. "Our design recycles 87% of the water that other systems waste." Beside him, Janice had created beautiful illustrations showing how their system could help communities without clean water access. "We got the idea after learning about water scarcity in Mrs. Peterson's geography class," she added with an infectious smile. "Important things should be beautiful too." Janet beamed with pride until she noticed Chad approaching their table, his interest clearly piqued by the twins' presentation. Her maternal instincts flared. These were her children, and she wouldn't let him hurt them the way he'd hurt her. "This is remarkable work," Chad said, kneeling to the children's level. His voice carried genuine admiration as he studied their display. "You've considered factors most adults would overlook." Jaden's eyes lit up at the praise. "The current filtration systems waste too much water in the cleaning process. Our design addresses that inefficiency while maintaining purification standards." "And we made it pretty," Janice added, pointing to her colorful diagrams with obvious pride. "Because if something's going to help people, it should make them happy to look at it too." Chad laughed, a genuine sound that Janet hadn't heard in years. "You're absolutely right," he agreed, his gaze drifting up to Janet with unspoken meaning. "Beauty and function working together is the highest form of innovation." The comment was clearly directed at her, and Janet felt heat rise in her cheeks, despite her best efforts to remain professionally distant. She moved closer to her children, standing protectively behind them. "Jaden and Janice are very talented," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "They clearly take after their mother," Chad replied, rising to his full height. The subtle floral scent she'd worn for years reached him, bringing back memories he'd tried desperately to bury. Late nights in the lab, when that fragrance had mingled with the smell of coffee and possibility. As both reached to adjust a tilting display card simultaneously, their fingers brushed accidentally. The contact sent electricity shooting up Janet's arm, and she pulled back as if burned, her heart racing at the familiar warmth of his touch. Chad's intake of breath told her he'd felt it too, that same current that had once flowed so easily between them. "Janet, there you are." Michael's voice cut through the moment like a blade. Her younger brother approached with his signature wide smile, though Janet noticed it cool several degrees when he spotted Chad. Michael embraced her warmly before extending his hand to the twins for their special family handshake. A complex series of movements passed down from their grandfather, a reminder of their strong family heritage and the bonds that had sustained Janet through her darkest moments. The twins executed the handshake perfectly, giggling with delight as they always did. The ritual felt especially meaningful today, grounding Janet in the love and support that had carried her through Chad's betrayal and the years of rebuilding that followed. "Sorry I'm late," Michael explained, his protective gaze never leaving Chad. "Got caught up at the office." He paused deliberately before extending a hand to the other man. Michael Wilkins, Janet's brother. Chad Huntsworth, came the reply, though both men clearly knew exactly who the other was. The tension between them was immediate and palpable. Michael had been the one to pick up the pieces after Chad's betrayal, watching his sister rebuild her career from scratch, while fighting through heartbreak and professional humiliation. "Mr. Huntsworth," Michael acknowledged, with minimal courtesy, before turning back to Janet. "Principal Matthews mentioned you're spearheading the partnership proposal." Janet nodded, slipping back into professional mode. "The presentation is scheduled for tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock in the conference room." Chad's eyebrows rose slightly. "You're developing the partnership structure?" "Ms. Wilkins leads our science department," Principal Matthews interrupted, appearing beside them with obvious pride. "Her credentials are quite impressive. She'll be your primary contact throughout this partnership." Chad's expression revealed nothing, but Janet knew him well enough to recognize the surprise in his eyes. The woman he'd betrayed had not only survived, but thrived, building expertise and respect in a field he thought he'd destroyed for her. "I look forward to working together," he said smoothly, though his voice carried undertones only Janet could interpret. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of polite conversation and careful avoidance. Janet found herself hyper-aware of Chad's presence across the room, the way his laugh carried over other conversations, how he seemed genuinely engaged with the students' projects. It was unsettling to see flashes of the man she'd once known, brilliant, passionate about innovation, capable of inspiring others to reach beyond their perceived limitations. As the fundraiser wound down, Chad approached Janet one final time, his expression serious. "Tomorrow's meeting," he said quietly, ensuring they wouldn't be overheard. "I want you to know that whatever happened between us in the past, it won't affect my evaluation of your proposal." Janet studied his face, searching for any sign of manipulation or hidden agenda. "Good," she replied simply, "because my proposal will stand on its own merits." Something flickered in Chad's eyes. Respect, perhaps, or regret. "I never doubted your abilities, Janet. That was never the issue." The admission hung between them, weighted with 5 years of unspoken words and unresolved pain. Before Janet could respond, Jaden and Janice appeared at her side, tired but excited from their evening of sharing their project. "Mommy, can we work on more experiments at home?" Jaden asked hopefully. "Mr. Huntsworth said our ideas could help lots of people." "We'll see," Janet replied diplomatically, helping them gather their materials. "Right now, it's time to get you two home and ready for school tomorrow." As they prepared to leave, Chad watched the family with an expression Janet couldn't quite read. There was longing there, and something else, a recognition of what he'd lost when he'd chosen ambition over integrity, corporate success over the woman who'd challenged and inspired him in ways no one else ever had. The conference room felt charged with tension the next morning as Janet arranged her presentation materials. She'd spent half the night refining her proposal, determined to show Chad and herself just how much she'd accomplished without him. The school board members filed in, followed by Chad and 2 executives from Huntsworth Innovations. Michael sat in the corner, ostensibly as the school's legal counsel, but Janet knew he was there for moral support. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice steady despite the nervous energy thrumming through her veins. "Huntsworth Innovations sponsorship presents an unprecedented opportunity for our students." As she moved through her presentation, Janet outlined a comprehensive partnership that would benefit both the school and the company. Her expertise shone through every slide, every carefully chosen word. This was her element, transforming complex scientific concepts into accessible, actionable plans. Chad watched her with growing admiration and something deeper, remorse for the brilliant mind he tried to diminish, pride in the woman who'd refused to let his betrayal define her limits. This wasn't the same Janet he'd known 5 years ago. This woman had been forged in adversity and emerged stronger, more confident, absolutely commanding in her authority. "The program would culminate in a Junior Innovation Challenge," she explained, clicking to her final slides, "where students develop solutions to real-world problems. With proper mentorship from Huntsworth engineers, these young minds could provide fresh perspectives on industry challenges." When she finished, the room erupted in enthusiastic applause. Even Chad's executives looked impressed, and Janet allowed herself a moment of professional satisfaction. "Any questions?" she asked, looking directly at Chad for the first time during the presentation. "Just one," he replied, leaning forward with unmistakable sincerity. "When can we start?" As the meeting concluded and people gathered their materials, Chad approached Janet with a folder. "These are some additional resources that might be useful for the program," he said, extending the documents toward her. Their hands touched as she accepted the folder, both pulling back instantly as though shocked. The brief contact sent familiar heat racing through Janet's system, and for a moment, her professional facade cracked, revealing the hurt that still lingered beneath her success. Chad noticed immediately. Of course he noticed. He'd always been attuned to her every expression, every subtle shift in mood. "Janet, he began, his voice dropping to that intimate tone she remembered too well. "The school board has my contact information," she interrupted, gathering her papers with hands that trembled slightly. "Your team can reach out to schedule the next steps." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Chad staring after her with the weight of their complicated history heavy in the air between them. But this time, she thought with fierce satisfaction, she was the one walking away, on her own terms. Has someone from your past ever reappeared in your life unexpectedly? The way they looked at you, spoke your name, brought back memories you thought you'd buried. Share your experience in the comments below. Sometimes the universe has plans we never saw coming. The school board unanimously approved the partnership with Huntsworth Innovations the following week, officially placing Janet in a position of expertise over the man who had once stolen her work. Their first official meeting took place in the small conference room adjacent to her classroom, the air thick with unspoken words as they reviewed the implementation timeline. "The resources you've allocated for the environmental science track are insufficient," Janet said, her tone clipped and professional as she slid the budget proposal across the table. "We'll need at least double the equipment to serve all interested students effectively." Chad made a note without argument, his pen moving across the paper with deliberate precision. "Done. What else?" His easy capitulation caught her off guard. The Chad she remembered would have challenged every expenditure, insisted on detailed justifications for each dollar spent. This new version of him was unsettling in its deference to her expertise. "The mentorship program needs restructuring," she continued, recovering quickly. "Your engineers can't just drop in occasionally. The students need consistent guidance to develop real understanding." "I agree completely," Chad said, surprising her again. "I've already spoken with our department heads about dedicating specific staff members to the program on a rotating basis." Janet narrowed her eyes, studying his face for any sign of the calculating executive she'd once known. "Why are you being so accommodating?" A ghost of a smile touched his lips, and for a moment she glimpsed the man who had once made her laugh until her sides ached. "Maybe I've learned a few things about recognizing good ideas when I hear them." The pointed comment hung between them, neither willing to directly address the elephant in the room, the brilliant idea he'd stolen and claimed as his own 5 years ago. Later that afternoon, Chad found himself observing Janet's teaching from the doorway of her classroom, drawn by the animated energy that seemed to radiate from the space. She moved with infectious enthusiasm, bringing complex scientific concepts to life for her wide-eyed students in ways that made even him excited about learning. "When matter changes state," she explained, carefully dropping dry ice into a container of warm water, "energy is either absorbed or released. Nothing in the universe happens without energy transfer." Fog billowed dramatically from the container, drawing gasps and delighted squeals from the children gathered around her demonstration table. "Is it magic, Ms. Wilkins?" asked Thomas, a serious-faced boy whose eyes were wide with wonder. "It's science, Thomas," she replied with a warm smile that transformed her entire face. "And that's even better than magic because you can understand it, control it, and use it to improve the world around us." Chad felt a familiar tightening in his chest as he watched her work. This was the Janet he'd first fallen for at Meridian. Brilliant, passionate, able to see wonder in the fundamental truths of the universe. The woman who had once looked at him with that same spark of excitement, who had made him believe he could be better than just another corporate climber trading on his family name. She noticed him watching and faltered momentarily, her professional composure slipping just enough for him to see the awareness that still flickered between them, despite everything that had happened. "Class, this is Mr. Huntsworth from our new corporate partner," she said, recovering smoothly. "He'll be helping fund our STEM program this year." 20 pairs of curious eyes turned to him expectantly, and Chad stepped into the classroom, suddenly aware that his usual boardroom confidence meant nothing here among these children who valued authenticity over authority. "Hello," he said, unconsciously rubbing his thumb against his fingers, a nervous habit Janet immediately recognized from their days working together. "I'm excited to see what you're all learning." "Do you know science too?" asked a little girl with carefully braided hair, her tone skeptical as she studied his expensive suit. "Not as well as Ms. Wilkins," he admitted honestly, earning a surprised glance from Janet. "But I know enough to recognize that you have an exceptional teacher." The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable, and for a moment, something shifted in Janet's expression. A softening she quickly masked as she turned back to her students. Their meetings continued over the following weeks, gradually thawing from icy formality to cautious professionalism. Chad found himself looking forward to their sessions, often lingering afterward to discuss ideas that went beyond their official agenda. Janet remained guarded, but occasionally he caught glimpses of the woman he'd once known, in her laugh when a demonstration went comically wrong, in her fierce advocacy for her students, in the elegant solutions she proposed to each challenge they encountered. It was during one of these late afternoon sessions that Bernice Huntsworth made an unexpected appearance, her scrutiny making Janet acutely aware of every interaction with Chad. "Mother," Chad said, clearly surprised as the elegantly dressed older woman entered the conference room. "I didn't know you were visiting the school today." "The board has expressed interest in our community investments," Bernice replied smoothly, her calculating gaze traveling between them with obvious assessment. "Ms. Wilkins, I understand you're the architect of this rather ambitious partnership. Your son has been equally invested in its success," Janet replied diplomatically, refusing to be intimidated by the woman's imperious presence. Bernice's perfectly arched eyebrow conveyed volumes of skepticism. "Has he?" Chad's sudden interest in elementary education has been quite the topic of conversation at our recent board meetings. Chad's jaw tightened visibly. "The innovation pipeline this program creates will benefit the company for years to come, Mother. It's a sound business decision." "Of course it is," Bernice agreed, though her tone suggested she found his explanation less than convincing. "I'll leave you to your work." After she departed, an uncomfortable silence filled the small room, heavy with implications neither wanted to address directly. "I apologize for my mother," Chad finally said, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. "She can be rather intimidating," Janet offered, her tone carefully neutral. "I was going to say intrusive," he replied, with a rueful smile. "But intimidating works too." Their eyes met across the table, and for a moment, they shared something close to the understanding they'd once had. Two people who knew what it was like to live under the weight of others' expectations. The evening shadows were long when Janet finally looked up from her calculations, surprised to find the school building empty around her. She'd lost track of time working on the environmental monitoring project, determined to have everything perfect for the students' first field test the next day. The intricate formulas reminded her of the pharmaceutical work she'd loved so much, the satisfaction of finding elegant solutions to complex problems. Gathering her papers, she stifled a yawn and reached for her jacket, only to remember she'd left it in her car that morning. The October air would be chilly, but the walk wasn't far. The sudden sound of footsteps in the hallway made her freeze, her heart racing as she realized how vulnerable she was, alone in the building after hours. "Janet?" Chad's voice called out, concerned and questioning. "Is someone still here?" Relief flooded through her as he appeared in her doorway, his tie loosened and jacket draped over his arm. Even disheveled from a long day, he managed to look effortlessly elegant. "I'm just finishing up," she explained, gesturing to the scattered papers covering her desk. Lost track of time, as usual. Chad nodded, with understanding that went deeper than professional courtesy. "You always did get completely absorbed in your work. Remember that night at Meridian when we ordered dinner at 6 and finally ate it cold at midnight? The memory surfaced unbidden, their shared excitement over a breakthrough in her stabilization formula, working side by side until they'd forgotten everything else existed. It had been the first night he'd kissed her, both of them riding the high of scientific discovery and finding something even more intoxicating in each other. "I need to get these organized for tomorrow," Janet said, deliberately changing the subject before the memory could pull her deeper into dangerous territory. "Let me help," Chad offered, setting down his briefcase and moving closer to her desk. They worked in companionable silence, organizing materials for the next day's lesson. When Janet reached for a folder on the high shelf behind her desk, exhaustion finally caught up with her and she swayed slightly, the long day and skipped meals taking their toll. "Whoa," Chad said, his hand instinctively reaching out to steady her elbow, his touch warm and protective. "When was the last time you actually ate something?" She couldn't remember, which was answer enough. "Sit down," he insisted, guiding her gently to her chair with hands that lingered a moment longer than necessary. "I'll be right back." He returned minutes later with a protein bar and bottle of water from his car. "It's not much, but it should help stabilize your blood sugar." Janet accepted them reluctantly, hyper-aware of how he watched her eat with genuine concern. "Thank you." "You're pushing yourself too hard," Chad observed, his voice carrying the same protective tone she remembered from their early days together. "This project matters," she replied simply, meaning more than just the school program, meaning the chance to prove herself, to show that his betrayal hadn't broken her spirit. "I know it does," he said quietly. "But you matter too, Janet." The sincerity in his voice caught her completely off guard, making her look up to meet his gaze directly. For a moment, the years between them seemed to fall away, leaving only the connection that had once felt strong enough to build a life on. Chad broke the silence first, seeming to realize how intimate the moment had become. "It's late. You should get home to the twins. They're staying with Michael tonight," she explained. "Field trip tomorrow. They wanted to get an early start." He nodded, then surprised her by removing his suit jacket and gently draping it over her shoulders. The gesture was so unexpected, so reminiscent of the man she'd once thought she knew, that Janet couldn't find words to refuse. His scent enveloped her, sandalwood and something uniquely him, that brought back memories she'd tried desperately to bury. The warmth of the fabric seemed to carry the heat of his body, creating an intimacy that was both comforting and dangerous. "Good night, Janet," he said softly, gathering his things and heading for the door. "Chad," she called after him, her voice barely above a whisper. He paused at the threshold, his back to her. "Yes? Why are you doing all this? The program, the consideration, treating me like—" She struggled to find the right words. "Like you actually respect my work." He was quiet for so long, she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion she hadn't heard from him in 5 years. "Maybe I'm trying to remember who I was before I became someone I don't recognize in the mirror." With that admission hanging in the air between them, he was gone, leaving Janet alone with his jacket and the dawning realization that the man who had broken her heart might be fighting just as hard to find his way back to the person worthy of her trust. The next morning brought an uncomfortable conversation at the breakfast table. Jaden studied her with his analytical gaze as she packed their field trip lunches, his 8-year-old mind already processing details most adults would miss. "Whose jacket is that by the door?" he asked without preamble, his tone carefully neutral in the way that meant he was testing a theory. "Just a colleague's," Janet replied, avoiding his penetrating stare as she focused intently on sandwich construction. "I forgot mine yesterday evening." "It looks expensive," Janice observed, tilting her head with the artistic eye she'd inherited from her father. "Is it from the man at the science fair? The one who keeps looking at you like he knows you?" Janet nearly dropped the apple she was holding, startled by her daughter's perceptiveness. "Why would you think that?" Janice shrugged with the casual wisdom of a child who saw emotional truths adults tried to hide. "Because you look at him the same way when you think nobody's watching you." Out of the mouths of babes, Janet busied herself with breakfast cleanup, grateful when the conversation turned to their upcoming field trip and the excitement of testing their water quality monitors in the local creek. Later that day, she returned Chad's jacket with a simple note of thanks, determined to maintain the professional boundaries that seemed to blur whenever he was near. But the damage was done. Something had shifted between them the night before, a crack in the wall she'd built around her heart. Chad discovered the twins' project contained the solution to his company's pharmaceutical crisis 3 days later. While reviewing the quarterly reports that showed their preservation system failing under extreme temperature variations, the elegant approach Jaden and Janice had developed for their water filtration could be adapted to solve the exact problem that had plagued Huntsworth's research division for months. The irony wasn't lost on him. Children had solved what his highly paid engineers couldn't, using principles derived from Janet's original research. Her brilliant mind, working through her equally brilliant children, had once again created the innovation his company desperately needed. But this time would be different. This time, he would make sure credit went where it belonged. At the next board meeting, Chad found himself defending Janet's program against increasingly skeptical executives, his voice rising with uncharacteristic passion as Richardson questioned the partnership's value. "This elementary school program is consuming significant resources," the older board member argued, his tone dismissive. "What's the actual return on investment beyond feel-good publicity?" "Innovation doesn't follow predictable timelines," Chad countered, his hands gripping the conference table edge. "These students represent our future talent pipeline, and dismissing their potential is short-sighted at best." "Since when did you become such an advocate for educational charity?" Richardson pressed, his smirk suggesting he knew exactly what buttons he was pushing. Chad's voice dropped dangerously low. "This isn't charity, it's investment in intellectual capital that has already proven its worth." "I think what my colleague is suggesting," interjected Hilda Mercer, Richardson's daughter and the newest board member, "is that perhaps your judgment in this matter isn't entirely objective." Chad turned to face her, taking in her perfect blonde updo and calculating smile. Hilda represented everything he'd once thought he wanted: corporate compatibility, strategic advantage, a partnership that would strengthen both their companies' positions. "Meaning what, exactly?" he challenged. "Just that your sudden interest in this particular school coincided rather conveniently with discovering a certain science teacher works there," Hilda replied with feigned innocence. "The same woman who left Meridian rather abruptly 5 years ago under somewhat mysterious circumstances." The implication hung in the air like poison, and Chad felt heat rising to his face as anger tightened his chest. Every eye in the room was on him, waiting to see how he would respond to the challenge. "Miss Wilkins is a brilliant scientist whose expertise benefits our program immeasurably," he stated, each word precise and controlled, despite the fury building inside him. "Questioning her credentials or my professional judgment is both inappropriate and counterproductive to this company's success." The room fell silent at his uncharacteristic show of emotion. Chad realized he was standing, hands planted firmly on the polished table, breathing hard as if he'd run a marathon defending someone who mattered more than his carefully maintained corporate image. "Perhaps we should take a brief recess," suggested his CFO, sensing the dangerous tension in the room. As the other board members filed out, Chad remained standing, staring out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the city below. His reflection showed a man he hardly recognized, flushed with emotion, defenses completely shattered, all for a woman who could barely stand to be in the same room with him. That evening, alone in his corner office long after the rest of the building had emptied, he practiced the words he needed to say to Janet. Not just about the failing product line or the board's scrutiny, but about the weight he'd carried for 5 years like a stone in his chest. "I stole your work," he said to the empty room, the admission bitter on his tongue. "I took credit for your brilliance because I was terrified of being overshadowed, of being seen as just another executive's son, riding on nepotism rather than merit." The words sounded hollow, even to his own ears. How could he expect forgiveness when he couldn't forgive himself? His phone chimed with tomorrow's schedule notification. A project review with Janet's class. Another opportunity to stand beside her, working together, yet separated by the wall of his past actions. Another chance to find the courage to speak the truth that might set them both free or destroy any possibility of redemption forever. Rain pelted against the classroom windows as Chad arrived for the project review, his usually perfect composure showing cracks of nervous energy. Janet was alone, organizing student portfolios by lamplight, the empty hallways making their meeting feel more intimate than either had anticipated. "The pharmaceutical preservation system," he said without preamble, setting down a thick folder of technical data. "It's failing in high-temperature environments. The very conditions your original research was designed to address." Janet looked up sharply, her hands stilling on the papers. "You're telling me this because I need your help," Chad admitted, his voice rough with emotion, "and because I owe you the truth." The classroom fell silent except for the steady drumming of rain against glass. Janet studied his face, searching for any sign of manipulation, but finding only raw honesty that made her chest tighten with unexpected emotion. "My classroom after hours," she said finally. "Tonight at 7. Bring all the data." For the next hour, they pored over research files, falling into the familiar rhythm of scientific problem-solving they'd once shared at Meridian. Janet asked incisive questions, quickly identifying weaknesses in the current approach with the brilliant analytical mind that had first captivated him years ago. "You implemented the formula incorrectly," she concluded, pointing to degradation patterns on her tablet screen. "The tertiary binding agent needs to be activated before introducing the stabilizer, not after." Chad ran both hands through his hair, frustration evident in every line of his body. "That wasn't in your notes." "Because it wasn't in my notes," Janet replied quietly. "It was in my head. I was still testing the activation sequence when..." She trailed off, the unspoken accusation hanging between them like a blade. "When I stole your research," Chad finished, his voice barely above a whisper. Janet met his gaze directly for the first time all evening. "Yes." The moment stretched between them, taut with 5 years of unresolved pain and anger. Chad stood abruptly, unable to remain still under the weight of his guilt. "I need to say something," he began, his voice strained with emotion. "Something I should have said 5 years ago, but I was too much of a coward." Janet remained seated, her expression guarded but listening. "I stole your work," he continued, the words rushing out as if afraid he'd lose courage. "I took credit for your brilliance because I was terrified, absolutely terrified, of being overshadowed, of everyone seeing that I was just another executive's son who couldn't innovate on his own merit." He began pacing the small classroom, his carefully controlled facade cracking with each word. "I convinced myself it was justified because my name would give the research more credibility, more funding, more impact. I told myself I was thinking about the greater good." Chad stopped pacing to face her directly, his green eyes dark with self-recrimination. "It was the worst decision of my life. Not just because I lost your respect, lost you, but because I betrayed everything I claimed to believe in. Innovation, integrity, the truth that real progress comes from collaborative brilliance, not corporate theft." Janet watched him fall apart, this powerful man who commanded boardrooms and billion-dollar decisions, reduced to raw honesty by the weight of his betrayal. "I don't expect forgiveness," Chad said, his voice breaking slightly. "I don't deserve it. But you deserve the truth. And the credit for work that should have made you famous in scientific circles instead of driving you from the field." The silence that followed felt endless. Janet rose slowly from her chair, approaching him with careful steps. "5 years," she said, her voice barely audible. "5 years I've carried this anger, wondering if you ever regretted what you did to me." "Every single day," he replied without hesitation. "Why now? Why tell me this now?" Chad's hands clenched at his sides as he struggled to find words for emotions he'd buried under corporate success. "Because seeing you again, watching you teach, seeing the brilliant woman you've become, despite what I did, it reminded me of who I was before, who I wanted to be. The man who wouldn't have been capable of betraying someone he..." He stopped, The admission too dangerous to complete. Someone you what? Janet pressed, stepping closer. Someone I loved, he whispered, the confession torn from somewhere deep in his chest. Someone I've never stopped loving, even when I convinced myself I had no right to those feelings. Janet's breath caught at his raw honesty. Something shifted in her expression. Not forgiveness, not yet, but perhaps the beginning of understanding that the man before her was genuinely broken by his choices. The formula can be fixed, she said finally, her voice professional even as her heart raced. I can show you the correct implementation sequence. Thank you, Chad replied, recognizing the olive branch for what it was. I'm not doing it for you, Janet clarified, though her tone had softened slightly. I'm doing it because that research could save lives, and that's why I developed it in the first place. They worked together late into the evening, rebuilding the formula sequence with careful precision. The familiar intellectual connections sparked between them, growing stronger as old patterns reasserted themselves, her intuitive leaps balanced by his methodical approach, his big-picture thinking complemented by her attention to crucial details. At one point, Janet looked up from her calculations to find Chad watching her with an expression that made her heart skip dangerously. The same look he'd given her years ago during their late-night collaboration sessions. Admiration mixed with something deeper, more dangerous. What? She asked, suddenly self-conscious under his intense gaze. He began, then shook his head as if clearing a spell. I missed this. Working with you. Being around someone who challenges me to think beyond profit margins and market share. The simple honesty of his statement caught her completely off guard. Before she could respond, her phone chimed with a text from Michael. Twins asking for bedtime video call. They miss their mom. I need to call my children, she said, grateful for the interruption that broke the dangerous intimacy building between them. Chad nodded, gathering his research materials. Of course, we've made excellent progress tonight. Janet connected the video call, her face softening instantly as the twins appeared on screen in their matching pajamas, hair still damp from bath time. Mom, we used the catalyst idea in chemistry club today. Jaden exclaimed without preamble, his excitement bubbling over. Mrs. Peterson said our approach was innovative thinking beyond our grade level. Is that the man from school behind you? Janice asked, peering past Janet to where Chad stood organizing papers in the background. The one who talks to you with his special voice? Janet felt heat rise in her cheeks. What special voice? The one that sounds different when he says your name, Janice replied with 8-year-old directness, like it matters more than other words. Out of the mouths of babes, Janet motioned Chad closer, her resolve crumbling under her children's innocent curiosity. Yes, this is Mr. Huntsworth, she said. We're working on a science project together. Like our filtration system? Jaden asked eagerly, his analytical mind immediately making connections. Something like that, Chad replied with a gentle smile that transformed his entire face. Your ideas actually helped us solve a very important problem. The twins beamed with pride, launching into an animated explanation of their day's experiments, while Janet watched the easy rapport developing between her children and the man who had once shattered her trust. It was unsettling how natural it felt, how right he looked interacting with the most precious parts of her world. After saying goodnight to the twins and ending the call, Janet found Chad studying the family photos on her desk with an expression of wistful longing. They're extraordinary, he said quietly. You've done an amazing job raising them. They make it easy, she replied, moving to stand beside him. They're naturally curious about everything. Like their mother, Chad observed, his voice carrying warmth that made her pulse quicken. As they gathered the research materials together, working in the comfortable silence that had once characterized their best collaborations, Chad said carefully, Janet, about what I told you earlier. I heard you. She interrupted, not unkindly. I'm just processing. 5 years of anger doesn't disappear in one evening. I understand, he replied. I know trust has to be rebuilt, not just declared. Janet paused in her organization, looking up to meet his gaze directly. The twins mentioned your suggestion helped with their project's success. They're brilliant, Chad said simply. They just needed someone to recognize their potential and encourage them to pursue it. Like someone once did for me, Janet said softly. Memories of their early collaboration surfacing, how he'd pushed her to think bigger, to believe her ideas could change the world. Their eyes met across the small space, and for a moment, the years between them seemed to dissolve. Janet was the first to break the connection, turning toward the door with hands that trembled slightly. "Good night, Chad," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Good night, Janet." 2 weeks later, Janet found herself in an unexpected position when Chad called with an urgent request. Would she consider having dinner with him and his 9-year-old niece Lily? His sister had been called away on an emergency business trip, leaving Chad as temporary guardian for a week, and he was clearly out of his depth with solo parenting. "I thought perhaps the twins could help Lily feel more comfortable," he explained over the phone, his usual corporate confidence replaced by something approaching panic. "She's been asking about the children from the science fair since that day." Janet's protective instincts warred with genuine sympathy for his obvious distress. "Chad, are you sure this is a good idea, mixing our personal situations?" "Probably not," he admitted with refreshing honesty. "But Lily's been through enough upheaval this week, and I remember how the twins made her smile at the fundraiser. Please, Janet, I'm drowning here." Against her better judgment, Janet agreed to the dinner, telling herself it was for the children's sake. But as she prepared her modest dining room and watched Chad arrive with a frightened-looking little girl clutching his hand, she realized how much she'd missed having him in her personal space. Lily was a delicate child with Chad's green eyes and an expression of carefully controlled anxiety that spoke of recent trauma. The twins immediately took her under their protective wing, showing her their latest project and including her in their pre-dinner ritual of setting the table with scientific precision. "We always put the forks on the left because that's where your non-dominant hand goes," Jaden explained seriously, "which leaves your dominant hand free for note-taking during dinner conversations about important discoveries." "Do you take notes while you eat?" Lily asked with the first spark of interest she'd shown since arriving. "Only when Mom tells us something really cool about chemistry," Janice replied, pulling Lily toward their project corner. "Want to see our crystal garden?" Chad watched the interaction with visible relief, his shoulders relaxing as his niece began to engage with the twins' infectious enthusiasm for learning. "Thank you," he said quietly to Janet as she finished preparing their simple dinner. "I had no idea how to connect with her. She's been so withdrawn since her mother left." "Children need consistency and genuine interest," Janet replied, stirring the pasta sauce. "You're doing better than you think." Dinner was a revelation in domestic harmony. The children chattered excitedly about their shared projects while Chad listened with obvious fascination, asking thoughtful questions that made them glow with pride. Janet found herself watching him interact with her children, really watching, and seeing qualities she'd forgotten he possessed. When Jaden launched into an explanation of molecular bonding that would have bored most adults to tears, Chad leaned forward with genuine engagement. "So the electrons are actually sharing space between atoms? That's incredible." "It's like friendship," Janice added with her characteristic insight. "Things are stronger when they share, instead of keeping everything to themselves." Chad's eyes met Janet's across the table, at the innocent profundity of her daughter's observation. "That's exactly right," he said softly. "Sharing makes everything stronger." After the children were settled in the living room with a documentary about marine biology, Janet and Chad found themselves alone in the kitchen, washing dishes in companionable silence that felt dangerously domestic. "This feels," Chad began, then stopped, seeming to reconsider his words. "Natural," Janet finished for him, surprised by her own honesty. "Yes," he replied, relief evident in his voice. "Like something I didn't know I was missing until now." Janet handed him a plate to dry, hyper-aware of how their fingers brushed during the exchange. "Chad, we need to be careful. The children are getting attached to this idea of us as whatever this is." "What if that's not entirely bad?" Chad asked quietly, his voice carrying hope and vulnerability in equal measure. Before Janet could answer, Lily appeared in the kitchen doorway, her small face creased with worry. "Uncle Chad, do I have to go back to boarding school when Mommy comes home?" Chad knelt immediately to her level, his expression gentle. We'll talk about what's best for you when your mother returns, sweetheart. But whatever happens, you'll always have people who care about you. Like Jaden and Janice? Lily asked hopefully. Exactly like Jaden and Janice, Chad confirmed, glancing up at Janet with a question in his eyes. You're always welcome here, Lily. Janet found herself saying, her maternal instincts overriding her caution. The twins would love to have you visit anytime. Relief flooded the little girl's face, and she impulsively hugged Janet before returning to the living room, where the twins were building a blanket fort. Thank you, Chad said as he rose to his full height, standing close enough that Janet could feel the warmth radiating from his body. For including her, for making her feel safe. She's a sweet child, Janet replied, acutely aware of their proximity. She just needs stability and love. Don't we all? Chad murmured, his voice dropping to that intimate tone that made her pulse quicken. The moment stretched between them, charged with possibility and the memory of what they'd once shared. When Chad's hand rose to touch her cheek with infinite gentleness, Janet didn't pull away. Janet, he whispered, her name a prayer on his lips. I know, she replied, understanding the question he was afraid to ask. When he leaned down to kiss her, it felt like coming home after a long journey through darkness. His lips were gentle but sure, carrying 5 years of regret and hope in their tender pressure. Janet's hands found the front of his shirt, anchoring herself to this moment of forgiveness and possibility. The kiss deepened slowly, years of separation and hurt dissolving in the connection that had never truly died between them. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing unsteadily, foreheads resting together in the intimate pose of lovers reunited. The children, Janet whispered, though she made no move to step away from his embrace. Or watching documentaries about fish, Chad replied softly, his arms tightening around her waist. Janet, I want to try again. Not just the partnership, not just friendship, everything. Chad, she began, uncertainty clear in her voice. I know I don't deserve another chance, he continued quickly. I know I have to earn back your trust, day by day, decision by decision. But I love you, Janet. I love your brilliant mind, your fierce protective instincts, the way you see wonder in everything. I love how you've raised those amazing children and how you make me want to be the man worthy of your respect. His confession hung between them, honest and vulnerable in a way that broke down her remaining defenses. I love you too, she admitted, the words torn from somewhere deep in her heart. I tried to stop, tried to hate you instead, but I never could completely let go. This time when their lips met, it was with the hunger of 5 years of separation, 5 years of dreams denied and hearts carefully guarded. Chad's hands tangled in her hair while Janet pulled him closer. Both of them lost in the rediscovery of a connection that had only grown stronger through adversity. Mommy, Janice's voice called from the living room. The octopus is changing colors. They broke apart reluctantly, both flushed and breathing hard, the spell of intimacy temporarily broken by the innocent demands of parenthood. We should, Janet began. Check on the children, Chad finished, though his eyes never left her face. But this conversation isn't over. No, Janet agreed, smoothing her hair with trembling hands. It's not. They returned to the living room to find the 3 children completely absorbed in the underwater footage. Lily nestled comfortably between the twins as if she'd always belonged there. The sight of their makeshift family unit made Chad's chest tighten with emotions he was only beginning to understand. Later, after Lily had fallen asleep on the couch and Chad had carried her carefully to his car, Janet walked him to the door with her heart racing and her mind spinning. Thank you for tonight, Chad said softly, mindful of the sleeping children, for letting us into your home, your family. Thank you for trusting me with Lily, Janet replied. She's lucky to have you caring for her. Chad stepped closer, his hand coming up to cup her face with reverent gentleness. Have dinner with me tomorrow night? Just us. No work, no children, no outside pressures. Just Janet and Chad. Figuring out what comes next. Janet leaned into his touch, her decision made somewhere between his confession and the moment she'd watched him comfort his frightened niece with such tenderness. Yes, she whispered. I'd like that very much. The smile that spread across Chad's face was radiant with hope and possibility. He leaned down to press one last gentle kiss to her lips, a promise of more intimate conversations to come. "Good night, Janet," he murmured against her mouth. "Good night, Chad." As his car disappeared down her quiet street, Janet touched her lips where the warmth of his kiss still lingered. For the first time in 5 years, the future felt full of possibilities she'd been afraid to imagine. 24 hours later, those possibilities felt even more real as their dinner date unfolded at an intimate restaurant across town. Their dinner date the following evening took place at an intimate restaurant across town, far from the possibility of running into colleagues or parents from school. Janet wore a simple blue dress that made her skin glow, while Chad had abandoned his usual corporate armor for khakis and a soft sweater that made him look younger, more approachable. "I keep expecting my phone to ring with some crisis," Chad admitted, reaching across the small table to take her hand. "I haven't been away from the office this long in years." "And how does it feel?" Janet asked, intertwining their fingers with growing comfort. "Terrifying and liberating in equal measure," he replied honestly. "Like I'm remembering what it means to live instead of just survive corporate politics." Their conversation flowed as easily as it had during their Meridian days, moving from scientific discoveries to childhood memories to dreams they'd each carefully buried under the weight of adult responsibilities. Janet found herself laughing more than she had in months, rediscovering the wit and intelligence that had first drawn her to him. "I never asked," Chad said as they shared dessert, "about the twins' father. You mentioned he passed away, but—" Janet's expression grew thoughtful. James was a chemical engineer, brilliant and passionate about using science to solve real-world problems. "We met in graduate school." She smiled at a memory. "Actually, you would have liked him. He had your same drive to make discoveries matter beyond the laboratory." Chad absorbed this glimpse into her past, understanding better the strength that had carried her through loss and single parenthood. "Were you together long?" 3 years, Janet replied. "He died in a car accident when I was 4 months pregnant. I'd just started my research position at Meridian, trying to balance grief and mourning sickness and this overwhelming responsibility of creating life alone." The vulnerability in her admission made Chad's chest tighten with protective instincts. "I can't imagine how difficult that must have been." "It was," she said simply, "but the twins gave me purpose when everything else felt meaningless. And then my work became a way to honor James's memory, to pursue the kind of innovations he would have championed." Chad brought her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "I'm sorry for all the pain you've carried alone, and I'm grateful that despite everything I put you through, you still found a way to build something beautiful." As the evening wound down, they walked slowly to their cars, neither ready for the night to end. In the parking lot, Chad pulled Janet into his arms, both of them savoring the freedom to touch openly without worrying about professional boundaries or curious observers. "I've been thinking," Chad murmured against her hair, "about the research director position at Huntsworth. It's opening up next month when Davis retires." Janet pulled back to study his face. "Chad, if you think I'd be interested in working for your company—" "Not for me," he interrupted quickly. "The position reports directly to the board. Complete autonomy over research priorities, substantial budget, your own team. It would be your division to run as you see fit." The offer was exactly the kind of opportunity Janet had dreamed of, but accepting it would mean their lives becoming even more intertwined. "I'll think about it," she said carefully. "That's all I ask." Chad replied, leaning down to kiss her with a tenderness that promised patience with whatever decision she made. Over the following weeks, Chad and Janet navigated the delicate balance of rebuilding their personal relationship while maintaining their professional partnership. The twins grew increasingly attached to Chad, who had started joining them for weekend science projects and family dinners with a frequency that felt natural to everyone involved. It was during one of these domestic evenings that Chad received the call that changed everything. His sister Grace was in a serious car accident, hospitalized in critical condition 3 states away. She would survive, but her recovery would take months, leaving 9-year-old Lily without a guardian. "I don't know anything about taking care of a child long-term," Chad confessed to Janet over the phone, his usual confidence completely shattered. A week was challenging enough. Grace won't be released for at least 2 months, and even then, she'll need extensive rehabilitation. Bring Lily here, Janet said without hesitation. The twins adore her, and you shouldn't try to handle this alone. Janet, I can't ask you to— You're not asking, she interrupted firmly. I'm offering. Family helps family, and whether you admit it or not, that's what we're becoming. The next few days transformed Janet's household as Chad moved into the guest room, and Lily took up residence in a makeshift bedroom they created in the twins' playroom. The adjustment was surprisingly smooth. The children fell into natural sibling dynamics, while Janet managed the logistics of suddenly parenting 3 instead of 2. Chad, however, was completely out of his depth. Corporate mergers he could handle. Bedtime stories and homework supervision left him floundering. Janet watched with growing affection as he struggled with the simple complexity of childhood, learning to braid Lily's hair, mastering the art of making pancakes that weren't burned, figuring out how to comfort a frightened little girl missing her mother. I'm failing at this, he confessed one evening, after Lily had cried herself to sleep, overwhelmed by the upheaval in her young life. She needs stability, and all I'm giving her is expensive takeout and awkward hugs. Janet found him in the kitchen, slumped over a cup of coffee with exhaustion and self-doubt written across his features. Without thinking, she moved behind his chair and began massaging the tension from his shoulders, her touch gentle but sure. You're not failing, she said softly. You're learning. Parenting isn't something you master in a week, Chad. It's a daily practice of showing up and doing your best. He leaned into her touch, some of the rigid control he maintained finally melting under her caring hands. I keep thinking about my own childhood, how distant my father was, how my mother measured love in achievements rather than affection. I don't want to repeat those patterns with Lily. Then don't, Janet said simply, her hands moving to the base of his neck, where stress had gathered. Love her the way you wish you'd been loved. Be present, be patient, be real with her. Chad turned in his chair to face her, his eyes dark with emotion and something deeper. Gratitude for the woman who had opened her home and heart to help him navigate uncharted territory. I don't know what I would have done without you, he said, his hands finding her waist and drawing her closer. You've saved us both. The intensity in his gaze made Janet's breath catch. When he pulled her down into his lap, she went willingly, her arms encircling his neck as their lips met in a kiss that spoke of need and gratitude and the growing intimacy of shared responsibility. The children are asleep, Chad murmured against her mouth, his voice rough with desire that had been building through days of domestic closeness. I know, Janet whispered back, her inhibitions dissolving in the heat of his touch. Their second complete love scene unfolded slowly in the quiet kitchen. Years of separation and recent weeks of growing trust, culminating in physical connection that was both passionate and reverent. Chad's hands mapped the curves of her body with worshipful attention, while Janet surrendered to the vulnerability of being truly seen by someone who knew both her brilliant mind and her protective heart. When they moved together, it was with the rhythm of 2 people who had found their way back to each other through forgiveness and the patient rebuilding of trust. Their bodies spoke the language of lovers reunited. Each touch healing old wounds, while creating new bonds of intimacy that transcended their complicated history. Later, wrapped in each other's arms on the living room couch, they talked quietly about the future, about Lily's needs, about their own relationship, about the family they were inadvertently creating through crisis and choice. I want to apply for temporary guardianship, Chad said, his fingers tracing patterns on Janet's bare shoulder. Grace's recovery will take months, and Lily needs stability more than she needs her mother's guilt-ridden phone calls from rehabilitation. That's a big decision, Janet replied, though her tone suggested approval rather than concern. I know, Chad acknowledged, but for the first time in my life, I'm thinking about what matters beyond quarterly profits and board approval. That little girl matters. This, he gestured between them, around the home where they'd found unexpected peace, matters more than anything I've ever achieved in a boardroom. Janet lifted her head to study his face in the dim lamplight. What are you saying? I'm saying I want to build something real with you, Janet. Not just a relationship, but a life. A family that includes the twins and Lily and whatever challenges come next. His voice grew thick with emotion. I'm saying I love you enough to put everything else second, the way I should have 5 years ago. Tears gathered in Janet's eyes at the sincerity of his declaration. Chad, you don't have to answer now, he said quickly. I know I'm asking for a lot of faith after what I did before, but I need you to know that everything I want starts and ends with you and those children upstairs. Instead of answering with words, Janet kissed him with all the love and hope and carefully guarded dreams she'd been afraid to acknowledge. In his arms, surrounded by the quiet evidence of the life they were building together, the future finally felt bright with possibility. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Bernice Huntsworth stood on Janet's front porch at 8 o'clock sharp, her expression unreadable as she took in the suburban neighborhood where her son had been staying. Mrs. Huntsworth, Janet said, opening the door with as much composure as she could muster, while still in her robe. This is unexpected. I imagine it is, Bernice replied crisply. May I come in? I believe we need to have a conversation. In the kitchen, they found Chad making pancakes, while the 3 children sat around the table in various states of morning dishevelment, chattering about their plans for the day. The domestic scene was so unlike anything Bernice associated with her corporate-minded son that she stopped short in the doorway. Grandmother, Lily exclaimed, launching herself into Bernice's arms with the easy affection of a well-loved grandchild. Hello, darling, Bernice said, her expression softening as she hugged the little girl. How are you adjusting to your temporary living situation? It's the best, Lily replied enthusiastically. Jaden and Janice are teaching me about chemistry, and Uncle Chad is learning to make really good pancakes instead of just buying them from restaurants. Bernice's eyebrows rose as she took in the flour-dusted state of her usually immaculate son. Is that so? Would you like to stay for breakfast? Chad asked, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely comfortable with his mother's unexpected appearance. I think that would be enlightening, Bernice replied, accepting a cup of coffee from Janet with surprising grace. The meal proceeded with the children carrying most of the conversation, completely unbothered by the undercurrents of adult tension. Bernice observed everything, how Chad patiently cut Lily's pancakes, how Janet automatically refilled Jaden's juice, how the 3 children included each other in every conversation with the natural generosity of siblings. After the children dispersed to get ready for their Saturday activities, Bernice remained at the kitchen table while Chad and Janet cleaned up with the easy coordination of an established couple. The board has been asking questions about your extended absence from the office, Bernice said without preamble. Richardson is particularly vocal about leadership inconsistency. Chad's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. I'm managing my responsibilities effectively while caring for family. The company isn't suffering. No, Bernice agreed, surprising him. In fact, productivity in your division has improved. Apparently, delegation suits you. She paused, studying Janet with calculating eyes. Ms. Wilkins, I understand you've been offered the research director position. I'm considering it, Janet replied carefully. What factors are influencing your decision? Bernice asked with the directness that had made her a formidable businesswoman. Janet glanced at Chad before answering honestly. Professional growth opportunities, research autonomy, the chance to lead innovation that matters, and yes, personal considerations about how the position might affect my relationship with your son. Bernice nodded approvingly. A refreshingly honest assessment. Most people would have pretended personal factors weren't relevant. She turned to Chad. And you? How do you feel about potential conflicts of interest? Janet's professional success doesn't threaten me, Chad replied firmly. It inspires me to be better at my own job. Interesting, Bernice mused. 5 years ago, you were intimidated by her achievements enough to steal credit. What's changed? The brutal directness of the question made both Chad and Janet freeze, but Bernice continued without missing a beat. Oh yes, I know about the research theft. I've always known. Did you think corporate intelligence missed something that significant? She fixed her son with a steely gaze. The question is whether you've grown enough to deserve this second chance you've apparently been given. Chad felt the weight of both women's attention, his mother's judgment and Janet's careful assessment. I've learned that real strength comes from building others up, not tearing them down. Janet's success makes me proud, not threatened. Good answer, Bernice said briskly. Because I'm recommending to the board that Miss Wilkins be offered the research director position with full autonomy and a substantial research budget. The company needs her expertise and, frankly, her moral compass might keep my son honest. The unexpected endorsement left both Chad and Janet speechless. Furthermore, Bernice continued, I'm also recommending that Chad transition to a role with more flexibility for family responsibilities. Perhaps Executive Vice President of Innovation Partnerships, focusing on community outreach and educational initiatives. Mother, what are you saying? Chad asked, confusion evident in his voice. Bernice smiled with genuine warmth for the first time since arriving. I'm saying that watching you this morning, really watching you be happy instead of just successful, reminded me why your father and I started this company, to build something meaningful. Something that could adapt and grow with the people we love. She stood, smoothing her perfectly tailored skirt. I should go. But Chad, bring the children to Sunday dinner next week. It's time Lily got properly acquainted with her extended family, and I'd like to get to know Jaden and Janice better. As she prepared to leave, Bernice paused at the door to address Janet directly. For what it's worth, my son is a better man with you and his wife. Don't let him forget that. After she left, Chad and Janet stood in stunned silence, processing the unexpected turn their lives had taken. Did your mother just give us her blessing? Janet asked incredulously. I think she did more than that, Chad replied, pulling her into his arms. I think she just handed us the future we were afraid to ask for. 3 weeks later, the annual corporate appreciation dinner transformed the elegant grand ballroom into a showcase of community partnerships. Janet wore a stunning, deep purple dress that complemented her dark skin beautifully, while Chad looked distinguished in his tailored tuxedo. The twins and Lily, dressed in their finest clothes, moved through the crowd with the confidence of children who belonged in every space they entered. You look absolutely radiant, Chad murmured in Janet's ear as they posed for photographs with school board members and corporate donors. So do you, she replied, straightening his bow tie with an intimate gesture that didn't go unnoticed by the watching crowd. Though I think we're causing quite a stir. She was right. Their easy intimacy, the way Chad's hand naturally found the small of her back, how Janet unconsciously leaned into his space, it all painted a picture of a couple deeply connected, despite the professional setting. From across the room, several teachers whispered among themselves, their expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed disapproval. Janet caught fragments of their conversation as she moved through the crowd. Quite sudden, isn't it? Powerful man like that. Wonder what she did to catch his attention. The racial and class undercurrents in their comments made Janet's spine stiffen with protective instincts she'd hoped wouldn't be necessary in this professional setting. Chad noticed her withdrawal immediately, his arm tightening around her waist in silent support. Ignore them, he said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to commanding rooms. Their small-mindedness says nothing about you and everything about their own limitations. It's not that simple, Chad, Janet replied, though she appreciated his defense. These are my colleagues. I have to work with them long after tonight ends. Before Chad could respond, a commotion near the entrance drew their attention. Hilda Mercer had arrived fashionably late, dressed in a stunning red gown that commanded attention, and accompanied by her father, Richardson. Her cold blue eyes swept the room, immediately locating Chad and Janet with predatory precision. Ah, the power couple of the evening, Bernice observed dryly, appearing beside them with a champagne flute and an expression of mild distaste. Hilda certainly knows how to make an entrance. Mother, please don't start anything tonight, Chad warned, though his tone suggested he was more concerned about protecting Janet than avoiding conflict. I wouldn't dream of it, Bernice replied innocently, though I can't speak for others' intentions. As if summoned by their conversation, Hilda approached with her signature calculating smile, Richardson trailing behind with the expression of a man prepared for battle. Chad. Darling, Hilda said, air kissing his cheek with possessive familiarity that made Janet's jaw clench. "You look wonderful. Corporate leadership suits you so well." "Hilda," Chad replied with cool professionalism. "Ms. Wilkins, I'd like you to meet Hilda Mercer, daughter of board member Richardson. Hilda, this is Janet Wilkins, our new research director." Hilda's smile turned razor-sharp as she extended a perfectly manicured hand. "The elementary school teacher. How quaint. Though I suppose everyone needs a hobby while they figure out their real career path." The insult was delivered with such polished cruelty that it took Janet's breath away. Before she could respond, Chad stepped closer to her side, his presence radiating protective fury. "Dr. Wilkins has more scientific credentials than half our research division," he said, his voice carrying dangerous undertones. "Perhaps you should familiarize yourself with her published work before making assumptions about her qualifications." "Of course," Hilda replied, though her eyes remained fixed on Janet with calculating assessment. "I'm sure her expertise is exactly what the company needs." The emphasis she placed on expertise made it clear she was questioning Janet's credentials, while implying that other factors had influenced her hiring. Janet felt heat rise in her cheeks, but maintained her composure through years of navigating similar microaggressions. "The children's projects have been remarkably successful," Richardson interjected, his tone suggesting he found the entire school partnership beneath serious corporate consideration. Though one wonders about the long-term return on such charitable endeavors. "Innovation doesn't always follow traditional investment models," Janet replied smoothly, though her hands clenched at her sides. "Some of our most significant breakthroughs have come from approaches that conventional wisdom would have dismissed." "How progressive," Hilda said, with false brightness. "Though I imagine the board will be interested in more concrete metrics when reviewing the program's continuation." The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. Janet felt Chad tense beside her, his protective instincts clearly warring with the need to maintain professional diplomacy. "Speaking of the children," Hilda continued, her gaze shifting to where the twins and Lily were demonstrating their latest project to an impressed group of donors. "They're quite articulate for their background. You must be very proud of how well they've adapted to these elevated social settings." The comment was poison-wrapped in silk, implying that the children didn't naturally belong in sophisticated company. Janet's maternal fury ignited, but before she could respond, an unexpected voice cut through the tension. "Intelligence knows no social boundaries, Miss Mercer," Bernice said crisply, moving to stand beside Janet in a gesture of unmistakable support. "Perhaps that's a lesson more adults should remember." Hilda's smile faltered slightly at the unexpected opposition from Chad's mother. "Of course, Mrs. Huntsworth. I simply meant—" "I know exactly what you meant," Bernice interrupted with the authority of someone who had navigated corporate politics for decades. "And I find it both inappropriate and intellectually limiting." The confrontation was attracting attention from nearby guests, creating exactly the kind of public spectacle that could damage careers and relationships. Chad stepped forward, his voice cutting through the tension with practiced diplomacy. "Perhaps we should focus on celebrating the program's success rather than questioning its participants," he suggested, though his eyes remained locked on Hilda with unmistakable warning. "Absolutely," Richardson agreed, clearly recognizing that his daughter had overplayed her hand. "The evening is about community partnership, after all." As the group began to disperse, Hilda leaned closer to Janet with a smile that never reached her eyes. "Enjoy the attention while it lasts," she whispered, just loud enough for Janet to hear. "Corporate fascinations tend to be temporary." The words hit their target with precision, awakening every insecurity Janet had fought to overcome since accepting the research director position. Chad noticed her pale complexion immediately, but before he could intervene, Principal Matthews appeared with a group of potential donors, eager to meet the brilliant scientist behind the partnership's success. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of professional conversation and forced smiles. Janet threw herself into discussing the children's achievements with genuine enthusiasm, but Hilda's poisonous words echoed in her mind. "Corporate fascinations tend to be temporary." Later, in the privacy of Chad's car, as they drove home with the sleeping children in the back seat, The tension finally exploded. "I should never have let her speak to you that way," Chad said, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. Hilda's comments were completely out of line. "Were they?" Janet asked quietly, staring out the passenger window at the city lights blurring past. "Maybe she's right. Maybe this is all just a fascinating diversion for you. The brilliant black woman and her gifted children making you feel progressive and enlightened." Chad pulled the car over so abruptly that Janet braced herself against the dashboard. In the sudden silence, with only the soft breathing of the children behind them, he turned to face her with an expression of such raw hurt that she immediately regretted her words. "Is that really what you think?" he asked, his voice barely controlled. "After everything we've shared, everything we've built together, you think this is some kind of corporate charity case for me?" "I don't know what to think," Janet admitted, exhaustion and insecurity bleeding through her usual composure. "Tonight made me realize how different our worlds really are. You belong in rooms like that, Chad. You were born to command that kind of respect and attention. But me? I'm the elementary school teacher who's sleeping with the CEO." "Stop," Chad commanded, his voice sharp enough to cut through her spiral of self-doubt. "Don't you dare reduce what we have to something that cheap and manipulative." He reached across the console to take her hands, his touch gentle despite the intensity of his emotions. "Janet, I love you. Not because you're brilliant, though you are. Not because you challenge me professionally, though you do. I love you because when I'm with you, I remember who I want to be instead of who I've been forced to become." Tears gathered in Janet's eyes as she absorbed his declaration. "Chad, those people tonight, Hilda, Richardson, even some of your colleagues, they see what they want to see. But I see the woman who revolutionized pharmaceutical preservation, who raised 2 extraordinary children alone, who opened her home to a frightened little girl, because it was the right thing to do." His voice grew thick with emotion. "I see the woman who forgave me when I didn't deserve it and loved me back to life when I'd forgotten what that felt like." The sincerity in his voice broke through the last of her defenses. Janet leaned across the console to kiss him with desperate intensity, pouring 5 years of insecurity and fear into the connection between them. "I'm sorry," she whispered against his lips. "I know you're not like that. Hilda she got into my head." "Which is exactly what she intended," Chad replied grimly. "But Janet, we can't let their small-mindedness poison what we're building. We're stronger than their prejudices and petty jealousies." As they resumed the drive home, Janet felt some of her confidence returning. Chad was right. Their relationship had been tested by far worse than corporate politics and social snobbery. They had survived betrayal, separation, and the complicated dynamics of blending their lives. They could certainly survive Hilda Mercer's calculated cruelty, but Hilda wasn't finished with them yet. The next Monday brought a new challenge in the form of an emergency board meeting called specifically to address concerns about leadership priorities and potential conflicts of interest. Chad sat at the head of the polished conference table, facing 12 board members whose expressions ranged from supportive to openly hostile. "Your personal relationship with the research director is creating complications," Richardson began, sliding photos across the table. "Social media coverage, public perception, the optics are problematic." Chad opened the folder to find professionally shot photographs of him and Janet throughout the evening, dancing closely, his hand on her back. Their intimate conversation during dinner. Taken individually, each image was innocent. Together, they painted a clear picture of a couple deeply involved romantically. "I fail to see how my personal relationship affects my professional performance," Chad replied, though he could feel the trap closing around them. "Don't you?" Richardson pressed. The research director position was created specifically for Miss Wilkins. Resources have been dramatically increased for her division, and the school partnership has received funding far beyond its original scope. "All decisions made after your relationship began. All decisions made because of proven results and demonstrated value," Chad countered. "Janet's division has already produced innovations that will generate millions in revenue. Perhaps, Bernice said quietly from her position at the far end of the table. But the perception of favoritism is almost as damaging as actual favoritism in terms of company reputation. Chad turned to his mother in surprise, feeling betrayed by her apparent shift in allegiance. "Mother, you were the one who recommended Janet for the position." "I recommended her based on qualifications," Bernice replied with her characteristic directness. "But I didn't anticipate the intensity of public interest in your personal relationship." Richardson leaned forward with the expression of a predator sensing weakness. "The board is prepared to offer Miss Wilkins a generous severance package to avoid any appearance of impropriety." The suggestion hit Chad like a physical blow. They wanted to force Janet out to protect corporate image, regardless of her contributions or the damage it would do to their relationship. "Absolutely not," Chad said, his voice carrying dangerous undertones. "Janet stays, or you'll have my resignation within the hour." "Chad, be reasonable," Richardson replied with false concern. "One relationship isn't worth destroying your career over." "This relationship is worth everything to me," Chad declared, rising from his chair with the authority of a man who had finally found his true priorities. "Janet Wilkins is the most brilliant scientist this company has ever employed. Her research division is already showing results that exceed our most optimistic projections. If you force her out because of small-minded prejudice and corporate politics, you'll lose not only her expertise, but my leadership as well." The room fell silent at his ultimatum. Several board members exchanged uncomfortable glances, clearly recognizing that losing both Chad and Janet would be a significant blow to the company's reputation and productivity. "Perhaps," suggested the CFO carefully, "we could find a compromise that addresses the perception issues without losing valuable personnel." "What kind of compromise?" Chad asked, though his tone suggested he was prepared to reject anything that diminished Janet's position or authority. "Independent oversight of the research division," Bernice proposed unexpectedly. "A committee of external scientists to review project priorities and budget allocations. Complete transparency that would eliminate any questions about favoritism, while preserving Dr. Wilkins' autonomy over day-to-day operations." Chad studied his mother's face, trying to determine whether this was genuine support or another form of corporate maneuvering. "And if the committee finds no evidence of favoritism or mismanagement, then all concerns are officially resolved, and Dr. Wilkins continues in her position without further interference," Bernice replied firmly. "It wasn't ideal, but it was better than losing Janet entirely." Chad nodded slowly. "I can accept those terms, provided the oversight committee is truly independent and the review is completed within 60 days. "Agreed," Richardson said, though his expression suggested he was far from finished. As the meeting adjourned and board members filed out, Chad remained alone, processing not just the political reality, but the personal cost of loving someone in his position. Loving Janet came with costs he was willing to pay, but he worried about the pressure these battles were placing on her shoulders. His phone buzzed with a text from Janet. "Heard about the meeting. Are you okay?" He typed back, "We'll talk tonight. Nothing changes between us." But as he gathered his papers and prepared to face the rest of his day, Chad couldn't shake the feeling that they were only at the beginning of a much larger fight. Hilda and Richardson had fired their opening shots, and they clearly weren't prepared to surrender without inflicting maximum damage on everyone involved. Have you ever had to stand up for someone you love against others' disapproval? Sometimes protecting the people who matter most requires us to risk everything we've built. Share your experience in the comments below. Your courage might inspire someone else facing a similar choice. 2 weeks after the board meeting, Janet received a call that would change everything. Dr. Elizabeth Carter from the prestigious Barrett Research Institute was calling with an offer that made Janet's heart race with professional excitement. "We've been following your work since your Meridian days," Dr. Carter explained over the phone. "Your chemical stabilization research was groundbreaking, and what you've accomplished at Huntsworth in just a few months has been equally impressive." Janet clutched the phone tighter, already sensing the magnitude of what was coming. "We'd like to offer you the position of Director of Environmental Applications at our Seattle campus," Dr. Carter continued. You'd be leading a team of 20 researchers, with a budget that's triple what most institutions can provide, and direct access to a global network of scientists working on climate solutions. The offer was everything Janet had dreamed of professionally: recognition at the highest levels, resources to pursue the kind of research that could change the world, and the chance to work with brilliant minds who shared her passion for innovation. But accepting would mean uprooting the twins from their school, leaving Michael and the extended family support system she built, and most painfully, leaving Chad just when their relationship had found solid ground. When would you need an answer? Janet asked, though her mind was already spinning with the implications. We're hoping to move quickly, Dr. Carter replied. We'd need your decision within 2 weeks, with relocation next month if you accept. I know it's sudden, but we have a critical climate preservation project starting in January that would be perfect for your expertise. That evening, Janet spread the Barrett Research Institute materials across her kitchen table. Detailed job descriptions, salary information, housing assistance, and information about Seattle's excellent school systems. The twins were at Michael's house for the night, giving her space to process the decision without their curious questions. Chad found her there when he returned from putting Lily to bed, his expression immediately shifting to concern when he saw the documents covering the table. The Barrett Research Institute, he read, recognizing the letterhead. Janet, this is incredible. They're one of the most prestigious climate research facilities in the world. I know, she replied quietly, studying his face for any sign of the reaction she most feared: relief that she might remove herself from his complicated corporate situation. Chad sat beside her, reading through the offer with the analytical mind that had made him successful in business. When he finished, he was quiet for a long moment. This is your dream job, he said finally, his voice carefully neutral. Everything you've worked toward professionally. Is that all you have to say? Janet asked, searching his face for any indication of his true feelings. Chad chose his words carefully, mindful of their history and his past mistakes. I would never ask you to give up an opportunity like this, Janet. Not after what happened before. Your career, your professional recognition, that has to come first. That's not what I'm asking, she said, frustration bleeding into her voice. I'm asking what you want, how you feel about the possibility of me moving 3,000 miles away. I want you to be happy, Chad replied honestly. I want you and the twins to have every opportunity you deserve. But selfishly, the thought of losing you again terrifies me more than any corporate crisis or board meeting. Janet felt tears prick her eyes at his raw honesty. And what about us? What happens to this family we've been building if I take the position? Chad took her hands in his thumbs tracing gentle circles over her knuckles. Then we find a way to make it work. Long distance, frequent visits. Maybe eventually I find opportunities in Seattle myself. Janet, I meant when I told the board. This relationship is worth everything to me. If Seattle is where your future lies, then we'll figure how to build our future there. You'd leave Huntsworth? Janet asked incredulously. After everything you've built, everything you've worked for. What I've built is a company, Chad replied simply. What we're building together, with the twins, with Lily, that's a family. And families figure things out together, no matter how complicated the logistics get. The sincerity in his voice made Janet's chest tighten with love and uncertainty in equal measure. I need time to think about this, to talk with the twins, with Michael. This decision affects everyone. Of course, Chad agreed, pulling her into his arms. Take all the time you need. Whatever you decide, we'll face it together. The next 2 days passed in a whirlwind of research and soul-searching. Janet visited Seattle virtually, toured the Barrett Research Institute's facilities online, and spoke with potential colleagues about the groundbreaking work they were doing. Professionally, every conversation confirmed that this was the opportunity of a lifetime. Personally, the decision became more complicated with each passing day. She watched Chad help Jaden with a particularly challenging math problem, his patience infinite as he guided her son through the logical steps. She saw him braid Lily's hair each morning with improving skill, creating elaborate patterns that made the little girl beam with pride. She noticed how naturally he'd integrated into their family rhythms, knowing which child needed encouragement versus space, anticipating Janice's creative needs, supporting her own professional goals without ever making her feel guilty for prioritizing her career. Meanwhile, Chad faced his own professional crossroads. The Independent Oversight Committee was scheduled to begin their review of Janet's division the following week, and Richardson had been dropping increasingly obvious hints about international expansion opportunities that would require extensive travel. Basically, pressure to choose between his relationship and his career advancement. "There's a potential partnership with our London office," Richardson mentioned during a casual hallway conversation. 6 months to a year abroad, working directly with European markets, the kind of opportunity that could position you for global leadership roles. The subtext was clear: distance himself from Janet, and corporate advancement would follow. Stay in Seattle building a family, and his professional future would stagnate. That weekend, while Janet was still wrestling with her decision, an unexpected conversation changed everything. The 3 children, Jaden, Janice, and Lily, had been unusually quiet during Saturday morning breakfast, exchanging meaningful glances that spoke of secret planning. "We need to talk to you," Jaden announced with the serious expression he wore when processing complex problems. "Both of you," Janice added, looking between Janet and Chad with uncharacteristic solemnity. Lily nodded vigorously, her small hands clutched around a folder they'd apparently prepared together. Chad and Janet exchanged curious glances as they settled in the living room, the children arranging themselves on the coffee table, facing their adults with the gravity of a corporate presentation. "We know Mom got offered a job in Seattle," Jaden began without preamble, his analytical mind cutting straight to the heart of the matter. "And we know Chad might have to travel for work," Janice added, her artistic intuition having picked up on the stress both adults had been trying to hide. "And we know everyone's worried about what happens to our family," Lily concluded, surprising the adults with her perceptive understanding of the situation. Janet felt her heart clench at their innocent use of the word family. These children had already claimed each other and Chad in ways that made adult complications seem secondary. "So we made a plan," Jaden announced, opening their folder to reveal hand-drawn charts, lists, and what appeared to be a PowerPoint presentation created on Lily's tablet. "A scientific plan," Janice clarified proudly, "with research and everything." For the next 20 minutes, the 3 children presented their solution to the adults, to level with the kind of logical thoroughness that would have impressed any corporate board. They'd researched Seattle's educational opportunities, compared cost of living between cities, investigated Chad's company's potential for West Coast expansion, and even looked into Lily's mother's rehabilitation progress. "Seattle has really good schools," Jaden explained, pointing to his carefully constructed charts. "And the science programs are even better than here. Plus, it rains a lot, which is good for our water filtration experiments," Janice added, with 8-year-old logic that somehow made perfect sense. "And Uncle Chad could start a new company branch there," Lily contributed, having clearly absorbed more adult conversations than anyone realized. "Mommy's getting better, but she said I could stay with Uncle Chad as long as I want, and I want to stay with everyone." The presentation concluded with a hand-drawn picture that made both adults' eyes water. All 5 of them standing in front of a house with mountains in the background, labeled "Our Family in Seattle" in Janice's careful handwriting. "You 3 have obviously put a lot of thought into this," Janet said, her voice thick with emotion. "We don't want our family to break apart," Jaden said simply, speaking the fear that had been driving all their careful planning. "Families are supposed to stick together," Janice added with the wisdom of a child who'd already lost one parent. "And we're a family now, right?" Lily asked, her voice small and hopeful. Chad looked at Janet over the children's heads, seeing his own emotional overwhelm reflected in her expression. These 3 young people had cut through weeks of adult complexity to identify what really mattered, staying together, supporting each other's dreams, choosing love over convenience. "Yes," Chad said finally, his voice rough with emotion. "We're definitely a family. The best kind," Janet added, pulling all 3 children into a group hug, that somehow managed to include Chad as well. That evening, after the children were asleep, Chad and Janet sat in their favorite spot on the living room couch, processing the day's revelation. "They're right, you know," Chad said quietly, "about what matters most." "Are you sure?" Janet asked, still struggling with the magnitude of what they'd be asking him to give up. "Your company, your mother, everything you've built here?" "I'm sure," Chad replied without hesitation. "Huntsworth will survive without me. It was successful before I became CEO, and it'll be successful after. But this family we've created, that's irreplaceable." Janet curled closer to him, feeling the last of her resistance crumble. "So we're really doing this? Moving across the country, starting over together?" "We're doing this," Chad confirmed, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "All of us, together." The decision felt both terrifying and absolutely right. The kind of leap of faith that transforms everything if you're brave enough to take it. The next Monday brought the crisis that would test their resolve. Janet arrived at Huntsworth to find Richardson and two other board members waiting in her office, their expressions suggesting they weren't there for a friendly visit. "Dr. Wilkins," Richardson began with false cordiality, "we need to discuss some concerns that have come to light during the Oversight Committee's preliminary review." Janet's stomach dropped, but she maintained her professional composure. "What kind of concerns?" "Irregularities in resource allocation, questions about project priorities, potential conflicts of interest," Richardson listed with obvious satisfaction. "The committee has requested a formal hearing to address these issues." The words hit Janet like physical blows. After everything she'd accomplished, everything she'd proven, they were still trying to destroy her credibility through bureaucratic manipulation. "I see," she said carefully. "And when would this hearing take place?" "Tomorrow morning," Richardson replied with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I know it's short notice, but the committee felt urgency was important given the sensitive nature of the situation." Janet recognized the trap immediately, a hearing with less than 24 hours' notice, giving her no time to prepare a proper defense or gather supporting evidence for her decisions. It was a classic corporate ambush, designed to create the appearance of due process while ensuring her failure. "Of course," she replied smoothly, "I'll be there." After they left, Janet sat alone in her office, staring at the research proposals and project updates that represented months of groundbreaking work. Tomorrow's hearing would likely end her tenure at Huntsworth, regardless of her actual performance or achievements. But strangely, instead of the panic she'd expected to feel, Janet found herself thinking about the children's presentation and their simple faith that families could overcome any obstacle together. Whatever happened in tomorrow's hearing, she had something more valuable than any corporate position. She had Chad, the twins, Lily, and a future built on love, rather than professional approval. For the first time in her career, work felt secondary to the life she was building beyond the office walls. Her phone rang. Chad, calling from his own crisis meeting with the board about the Seattle opportunity and his potential departure from Huntsworth. "How did it go?" she asked, though his tone had already given her the answer. "About as well as expected," Chad replied grimly. "They're not happy about losing both of us, but they can't legally prevent us from leaving." "Are you sure about this?" Janet asked one final time. "Once we announce our decisions, there's no going back." "I've never been more sure of anything," Chad replied with absolute certainty. "Our family comes first, Janet. Everything else is just details we'll figure out together." As Janet hung up the phone and began preparing for what would likely be her final day at Huntsworth Innovations, she felt a strange sense of peace. Tomorrow's hearing might end her corporate career, but it was also the beginning of something bigger, a life built on authentic connection rather than professional achievement. The thought of facing Richardson's ambush no longer terrified her. She had already won the only battle that truly mattered. Relief flooded through Janet so powerfully that her knees nearly buckled. Chad moved immediately to steady her, his arm wrapping around her waist in a gesture of support that no longer needed to be hidden. "However," Dr. Foster continued, "the allegations of historical research theft require formal investigation and resolution. Mr. Huntsworth, Are you prepared to submit to a full ethics review regarding these admitted violations? I am, Chad replied without hesitation. Complete transparency, full cooperation, whatever consequences are determined appropriate. The committee excused themselves to deliberate, leaving the family alone in the boardroom. The children immediately surrounded Janet, chattering excitedly about their successful intervention, while Chad watched with an expression of profound love and pride. Did we help? Lily asked hopefully. You were perfect, Janet assured her, pulling all three children into a grateful hug. All of you. As the chaos settled and they waited for the committee's final decision, Chad took Janet's hand, intertwining their fingers with the certainty of a man who had found his true priorities. Whatever they decide about my ethics review, whatever consequences I face for the theft, he said quietly, I need you to know that standing up for you was the first truly ethical thing I've done in 5 years. Chad, Janet began, emotion thick in her voice. I love you, he continued, heedless of their audience. I love our family, the future we're building. If the board decides I'm unfit to lead, we'll build something better elsewhere. Janet rose on her tiptoes to kiss him, pouring 5 years of forgiveness and hope into the connection between them. When they broke apart, they found themselves surrounded by applauding children and one elegantly dressed grandmother whose eyes glistened with unshed tears. Well, Bernice said with characteristic briskness, I suppose this means Sunday dinner will be even more interesting going forward. 2 hours later, the committee returned with their decision. Dr. Wilkins would not only retain her position, but receive the promotion Chad had recommended, complete with equity partnership and expanded research autonomy. Chad would face a formal ethics review, but would remain as CEO pending its completion, with the understanding that his full disclosure and restitution efforts would be considered mitigating factors. Relief flooded through Janet so powerfully that her knees nearly buckled. Chad moved immediately to steady her, his arm wrapping around her waist in a gesture of support that no longer needed to be hidden. However, Dr. Foster continued, the allegations of historical research theft require formal investigation and resolution. Mr. Huntsworth, are you prepared to submit to a full ethics review regarding these admitted violations? I am, Chad replied without hesitation. Complete transparency, full cooperation, whatever consequences are determined appropriate. The committee excused themselves to deliberate, leaving the family alone in the boardroom. The children immediately surrounded Janet, chattering excitedly about their successful intervention, while Chad watched with an expression of profound love and pride. Did we help? Lily asked hopefully. You were perfect, Janet assured her, pulling all three children into a grateful hug. All of you. As the chaos settled and they waited for the committee's final decision, Chad took Janet's hand, intertwining their fingers with the certainty of a man who had found his true priorities. Whatever they decide about my ethics review, whatever consequences I face for the theft, he said quietly, I need you to know that standing up for you was the first truly ethical thing I've done in 5 years. Chad, Janet began, emotion thick in her voice. They love you, he continued, heedless of their audience. I love our family, the future we're building. If the board decides I'm unfit to lead, we'll build something better elsewhere. Janet rose on her tiptoes to kiss him, pouring 5 years of forgiveness and hope into the connection between them. When they broke apart, they found themselves surrounded by applauding children and one elegantly dressed grandmother whose eyes glistened with unshed tears. Well, Bernice said, with characteristic briskness, I suppose this means Sunday dinner will be even more interesting going forward. 2 hours later, the committee returned with their decision. Dr. Wilkins would not only retain her position, but receive the promotion Chad had recommended, complete with equity partnership and expanded research autonomy. Chad would face a formal ethics review, but would remain as CEO pending its completion, with the understanding that his full disclosure and restitution efforts would be considered mitigating factors. Most surprisingly, the committee recommended that Huntsworth Innovations establish a new ethics framework based on transparency and collaborative innovation, essentially institutionalizing the values that Chad and Janet had fought to preserve. Dr. Foster addressed the remaining board members with clinical precision. This committee also finds evidence of procedural violations in how this hearing was initiated. The rush timeline, lack of proper notice, and clear personal motivations behind certain complaints raise serious questions about board oversight protocols. Richardson's face went ashen as the implications became clear. Within hours, he would quietly submit his resignation to avoid a formal ethics investigation into his own conduct. As they left the boardroom together, all five of them, plus Bernice, who had insisted on joining them for ice cream to celebrate, Janet reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. 5 years ago, corporate betrayal had nearly destroyed her faith in both science and love. Today, the same boardroom had become the setting for her complete professional vindication and the public declaration of a love worth fighting for. "So," Chad said as they walked through the parking garage, Willie riding on his shoulders while the twins flanked Janet on either side. "Does this mean you're turning down the Seattle offer?" Janet smiled, looking around at the family they had built through crisis and choice, forgiveness and fierce love. "I think Seattle will have to wait. We have important work to do here." "The most important work," Chad agreed, shifting Lily to reach for Janet's hand. Behind them, Bernice watched her son with satisfaction. She had built a company, but Chad had built something far more valuable, a family, united by love, integrity, and the courage to choose each other above all else. The man who had once stolen Janet's work had become the man willing to sacrifice everything to ensure she received the recognition she deserved. And in doing so, he had found redemption, not through corporate success, but through the transformative power of love offered freely and accepted completely. 1 year later, the grand ballroom of the International Science Innovation Center sparkled with lights as Janet stepped to the podium, her confidence evident in every movement. The past year as Chief Innovation Officer at Huntsworth had transformed not only her professional life, but the entire company's approach to research and development. Chad watched from the front row, pride swelling in his chest as she began her keynote presentation on sustainable pharmaceutical delivery systems for developing nations. Beside him, the twins fidgeted excitedly in their formal clothes, while Lily sat between Chad and Bernice, who had become an unexpectedly devoted grandmother figure to all 3 children. "Our breakthrough came from an unexpected source," Janet was saying, clicking to a slide that showed the twins' original filtration design. 2 young scientists who approached a persistent problem from a completely fresh perspective, reminding us that innovation requires us to see through new eyes. Her gaze found her family in the audience, a warm smile softening her professional demeanor. Sometimes the most profound discoveries come not from laboratories or corporate research divisions, but from curious minds willing to question established methods and remember why we began this work in the first place: to improve lives and create solutions that serve humanity's greatest needs. As Janet continued her presentation, Chad reflected on the remarkable journey that had brought them to this moment. The twins' water filtration project had indeed revolutionized Huntsworth's approach to pharmaceutical preservation, leading to innovations that were now being implemented in over 30 countries. Under Janet's leadership, the research division had become the company's most profitable and respected department. More importantly, the ethics framework established after Chad's confession had transformed Huntsworth's entire corporate culture. Transparency, collaborative innovation, and recognition of diverse contributions had become core values rather than mere policy statements. The new framework had claimed its first casualties as well. Richardson's resignation had triggered an investigation that revealed a pattern of using board position for personal vendettas. Hilda's consulting firm, built largely on her father's connections, quietly folded within 6 months as corporate clients distanced themselves from the family name. Accountability, Janet had observed during one of their family dinners, turns out to be remarkably effective at cleaning house. The company had not only survived the scandal of Chad's admitted research theft, but emerged stronger, with a reputation for integrity that attracted top scientific talent from around the world. After the presentation concluded to enthusiastic applause, they made their way through the crowd of congratulatory colleagues and international scientists. The recognition Janet was receiving felt like justice finally served. Her name now appeared on patents that should have borne her attribution years ago, and her innovative approaches were being studied and replicated by researchers globally. "Exceptional presentation, Dr. Huntsworth Wilkins," said Dr. Elizabeth Carter from the Barrett Research Institute, the same woman who had offered Janet the Seattle position a year earlier. "Your collaborative approach to innovation is exactly what our field needs." Janet smiled at the use of her hyphenated name, a choice that honored both her past and her future. "Thank you, Dr. Carter. Collaboration has taught us that the best solutions come from diverse perspectives working together." As they mingled with international colleagues, Lily tugged on Chad's sleeve with 8-year-old urgency. "Uncle Chad, can we show the Science Museum lady our new project? We figured out how to make water filters that work in space." "If it's all right with your aunt and uncle," Chad replied, smiling at the children's endless enthusiasm for discovery. The title Uncle had evolved naturally over the past year. While Chad had received temporary guardianship of Lily during his sister's extended rehabilitation, Grace's recovery had progressed well enough for her to resume partial custody. However, Lily spent most of her time with Chad and Janet's family, thriving in the stability and intellectual stimulation they provided. The arrangement worked beautifully for everyone involved, creating an extended family network that supported all the children's growth and development. Later that evening, after a celebratory dinner, where Jaden regaled everyone with facts from the Science Museum, and Janice presented her mother with a congratulatory drawing of the family at the conference, Chad and Janet finally had a moment alone on their hotel room balcony, overlooking the city. "So, Chief Innovation Officer Huntsworth Wilkins," Chad said, handing her a glass of champagne, "how does it feel to be the star of international pharmaceutical innovation?" Janet laughed, the sound free and genuine. "Surreal, honestly. 2 years ago, I was teaching elementary school science and nursing old grudges. Now I'm presenting to Nobel laureates and leading research that could change how medications are preserved globally." "You were always meant for this level of recognition," Chad said softly, moving to stand behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist. "I knew that the moment I met you at Meridian, which makes what I did even more unforgivable." Janet leaned back against his chest, feeling the solid warmth of the man who had traveled such a long journey from the person who had betrayed her trust. "You've more than made up for past mistakes, Chad. The way you stood up for me in that boardroom, the complete vindication when Richardson's schemes were exposed, the restitution you've provided, it's been more than I ever expected." "It was the least I could do," Chad replied, pressing a gentle kiss to her temple. "Though I admit I had selfish motivations beyond justice." "Oh?" Janet turned in his arms, curious about his meaning. Chad smiled, reaching into his pocket to produce a small velvet box that made Janet's breath catch in her throat. "I wanted to be worthy of asking you this question." He knelt on the hotel balcony, the city lights creating a romantic backdrop as he opened the box to reveal a ring that sparkled with the same brilliance as Janet's mind. "Janet Wilkins, you've given me a second chance I never deserved. You've shown me what it means to be part of something bigger than corporate success or personal ambition. Will you marry me?" Tears gathered in Janet's eyes as she looked down at the man who had once broken her heart and then spent a year rebuilding it with daily acts of love, respect, and unwavering support. "The twins will need to approve, you know," she said, a smile breaking through her tears. Chad laughed softly. "I already asked them." Jaden had a list of logical reasons why marriage made sense for family stability and tax benefits. "Janice made me promise to always read bedtime stories in different voices for all the characters." "You asked my children for permission?" Janet's voice caught with emotion at the thoughtfulness of the gesture. "Of course," Chad replied simply. "We're a package deal, remember? You, Jaden, Janice, Lily, and even my mother, who's become surprisingly attached to all of you. This isn't just about us. It's about the family we've built together." Janet knelt beside him on the balcony, taking his face in her hands. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you, Chad Huntsworth." As he slipped the ring onto her finger and gathered her into his arms, Chad felt a completeness that transcended any corporate achievement. In Janet's forgiveness, he had found redemption. In her children's acceptance, he had discovered belonging, and in this second chance, he had learned what it meant to build a life on love rather than ambition. "Should we call the twins and tell them?" Janet asked, nestling against his chest. "They made me promise to video call them the moment you said yes," Chad admitted with a chuckle. "They have a whole celebration planned for breakfast tomorrow." Janet laughed, imagining the excited chaos that would greet their news. "Of course they do." As they returned to their room to share their engagement news with 3 very excited children via video call, Chad reflected on the transformation that love had worked in his life. The man who had once stolen Janet's research out of fear and insecurity had become someone willing to sacrifice everything to ensure she received the recognition she deserved. 6 months later, their wedding took place in the very school auditorium where they had first encountered each other again. The space transformed with elegant decorations while maintaining the educational atmosphere that had brought them back together. Jaden served as ring bearer with scientific precision, while Janice was the most artistic flower girl anyone had ever seen. Lily stood beside Janet as Junuvate of honor, beaming with joy at the official recognition of the family bonds they had all felt for months. Michael walked Janet down the aisle, his initial wariness of Chad having transformed into genuine respect and brotherly affection. Bernice sat in the front row, dabbing at her eyes with elegant discretion as she watched her son marry the woman who had made him a better man. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came during the ceremony when Chad's vows included not just promises to Janet, but commitments to Jaden and Janice as well, pledging to support their dreams, encourage their curiosity, and be the stepfather they deserved, even as he honored the memory of the father they had lost. "I promise to love your brilliant minds, to challenge your assumptions, and to always believe in your capacity to change the world," he said to the twins, his voice thick with emotion. "And I promise your mother that I will spend every day proving worthy of the trust you've all placed in me." The reception featured the twins demonstrating their latest project, a water purification system that could operate in zero-gravity environments, a development that had NASA scientists taking notes. Lily performed a dance she had choreographed herself, incorporating the molecular structures she'd learned from her adopted siblings. And Bernice gave a speech that surprised everyone with its warmth and genuine affection for the woman who had brought her son back to life. As the evening wound down and the family returned to the home they now officially shared, Chad found himself marveling at how completely his life had transformed. The corporate success that had once seemed so important felt secondary to the laughter echoing through their house, the science projects covering every available surface, and the profound contentment of belonging to something real and lasting. 2 years later, as Janet announced her pregnancy to a room full of excited family members, Chad realized that the greatest innovation of his life hadn't happened in a laboratory or boardroom. It had happened in the slow, patient rebuilding of trust and the daily choice to put love before ambition, family before corporate advancement, and integrity before personal gain. The man who had stolen Janet's work had become the man who spent his life ensuring she received every recognition she deserved. And in that transformation, he had discovered that the most valuable discoveries aren't found in research data or patent applications, but in the courage to choose love over fear, to rebuild what has been broken, and to believe that second chances can lead to happiness beyond anything you dared to imagine. Their story had begun with betrayal and heartbreak, but it had become something beautiful, a testament to the transformative power of forgiveness, the strength found in choosing each other daily, and the profound truth that real love doesn't just survive adversity, it grows stronger because of it. Second chances are rare treasures in this world, aren't they? Like Janet discovered, sometimes the person who hurt you the most can become the one who heals your heart completely. It takes tremendous courage to open yourself to that possibility, to see beyond past wounds and recognize genuine change. Has someone in your life earned a second chance through their actions? That moment when their consistent effort, genuine remorse, and changed behavior finally broke through your walls. Or perhaps you've been Chad in this story, someone who made a terrible mistake and worked tirelessly to prove you're more than your worst decision. I believe true redemption isn't found in words or promises, but in actions repeated day after day. Janet knew Chad deserved that second chance when he put everything on the line: his career, his reputation, his comfortable life, to stand by her and her children, when his choices consistently showed that he'd become a man of integrity, not just a man of ambition. What signs showed you that someone deserved your forgiveness? Was it a grand gesture like Chad's willingness to sacrifice his position, or the quiet consistency of showing up when it mattered most? Share your experience in the comments below. Your story might help someone else struggling with whether to open their heart again. If this tale of forgiveness, second chances, and finding love where you least expect it touched your heart, please subscribe and hit that notification bell to join our Royal Story family. Each story I share is crafted with love, especially for you, my beautiful listeners who understand that life's greatest transformations often come through our deepest wounds. I'll return with another story that explores how love can transform even the most guarded hearts, how sometimes the people who seem the strongest are simply waiting for someone brave enough to see past their walls. Until then, remember that you too are royalty, worthy of love that honors your value and sees the treasure of who you truly are.